The first hint that my planned weekend of solitary fishing and quiet contemplation at our lakeside cabin was about to be significantly derailed came not from a weather report or a change in road conditions, but from the faint, yet unmistakable, aroma of my father-in-law Gregory's aggressively pungent pipe tobacco. It hit me the moment I stepped out of my car onto the gravel driveway, a full day earlier than I'd informed anyone I was arriving. The scent, a noxious blend of cherry and something vaguely medicinal, was as out of place in the crisp, pine-scented air as a concrete mixer in a cathedral. My name is Arthur Finch, 48 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I've worked as a senior risk analyst for a multinational financial services corporation. My job, in essence, is to identify potential threats, assess vulnerabilities, and predict the likelihood of adverse outcomes based on available data and observable patterns. Gregory's pipe smoke, drifting from the direction of our cabin, was an immediate, high-probability indicator of an adverse outcome to my planned solitude. My wife, Clara, and I had, with what I now considered a perhaps naive generosity, offered her parents, Gregory and Beatrice, the exclusive use of our cabin for the entire month of August. It was meant as a gesture of goodwill, a chance for them to escape the city's oppressive summer heat and enjoy the tranquility of the lake. We had planned to drive up together on Saturday afternoon to join them for the final long weekend of their stay. However, a critical project at work had concluded ahead of schedule, granting me an unexpected Friday off. I decided to surprise Clara, who was still in the city finishing her week as a pediatric nurse, by heading up early, hoping for a full day of casting lines and clearing my head before the more concentrated family dynamic ensued. The tranquility, it appeared, had already been significantly compromised. Peering through the large picture window of the living room, my initial mild annoyance at the premature olfactory assault quickly escalated into something far more disquieting. Gregory was indeed in residence, comfortably ensconced in my favorite worn leather armchair, a tumbler of what looked suspiciously like my best 18-year-old single malt scotch, a bottle I reserved for truly exceptional occasions, cradled in his hand. Beatrice, his wife and Clara's mother, was bustling in the small kitchen area, her back to me. But they were not, as I had naively assumed they would be, alone. Seated on the sofa, looking entirely and rather gallingly at home, was Clara's younger sister, Cassandra, and her perpetually hapless husband, Derek. And spread across the antique pine coffee table between them were not the expected remnants of a leisurely breakfast or a half-finished jigsaw puzzle, but a sheaf of glossy, professional-looking brochures and what appeared to be a set of architectural blueprints. Cassandra, her face animated with a familiar, slightly desperate enthusiasm that always preceded one of her ill-fated business ventures, was gesturing emphatically at the blueprints. Derek, a man whose primary skill seemed to be nodding agreeably to any scheme that promised minimal effort and maximum, if entirely illusory, reward, was true to form, nodding vigorously. Gregory and Beatrice, and this was the truly alarming data point, were listening with an uncharacteristic attentiveness, their expressions a mixture of something I could only interpret as avaricious interest. I didn't knock. I didn't clear my throat. My professional instincts, honed by years of sifting through layers of carefully constructed corporate misdirection, immediately took over. This was not an impromptu family gathering. This had all the hallmarks of a clandestine planning session, a private presentation, and the fact that it was taking place in my cabin, without my knowledge, involving my best scotch, and centered around blueprints that seemed to depict our property, triggered a cascade of internal alarms that drowned out any immediate emotional response. I am, by nature and by training, a man who prefers observation and analysis before action. Rash confrontations, emotional outbursts. These are variables that introduce unnecessary noise into any complex system, obscuring the underlying data. In this situation, I sensed with a certainty that chilled me far more than the early morning air, was about to become very complex indeed. I quietly retreated from the window, my mind already whirring, processing the initial unsettling inputs. Cassandra's well-documented history of failed get-rich-quick schemes, usually funded by reluctant, guilt-tripped family members. Derek's chronic inability to hold down a steady job, coupled with his unwavering belief in his own, entirely unsubstantiated business acumen. Gregory's lifelong grumbling about his inadequate pension and his constant, unsolicited advice on how I should be managing my finances for greater returns. Beatrice's passive-aggressive complaints about the modest size of their retirement cottage compared to the lavish lakeside retreat Clara and I had managed to acquire, thanks, in no small part, to a significant inheritance from my side of the family, a detail she conveniently overlooked. The data points, when viewed in this new, unexpected context, began to coalesce into a disturbing, if still incomplete, pattern. My surprise fishing trip had just morphed into an unscheduled and entirely unwelcome risk assessment. The primary asset under potential threat, our cabin, our sanctuary, my grandfather's legacy. The potential perpetrators, my own in-laws, and their feckless, opportunistic appendages. My objective, to ascertain the full nature and scope of this threat, and to formulate a strategy for its neutralization, before Clara, with her kind heart and her unfortunate blind spot where her sister's manipulations were concerned, could be drawn into their web. The element of surprise, I realized, was now mine. And, as any good risk analyst knows, surprise, when properly leveraged, can be a decisive strategic advantage. The fish, I decided, could wait. There were far more significant, and potentially far more predatory, creatures to observe in their unnatural and deeply unsettling habitat. The audit of Project Cabin Fever had officially, if covertly, begun. My decision to offer Gregory and Beatrice the extended, unsupervised use of our cabin had been, I now admitted to myself with a grimace, a strategic miscalculation on my part, a failure to adequately assess the known risk factors presented by my wife's family. Clara, bless her generous and often overly trusting heart, had been insistent. "Oh, Arthur, they'll be so thrilled. Mom's been so stressed with her garden club politics, and Dad's blood pressure has been a bit high. A month by the lake will do them a world of good." I had voiced my reservations, particularly about the potential for unscheduled ancillary guests, namely Cassandra and Derek. Cassandra, Clara's younger sister by 5 years, possessed an almost supernatural talent for materializing wherever there was a hint of free lodging, complimentary meals, or potential financial opportunity. Her husband, Derek, a man whose primary contribution to any endeavor seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of ill-informed opinions and a remarkable capacity for consuming other people's beer, was invariably attached to her, like a particularly unglamorous remora. "No, no, darling," Clara had assured me, her eyes wide with an innocence I sometimes found both endearing and exasperating. "I've made it perfectly clear. This is just for Mom and Dad. A quiet, restful retreat. Cassie and Derek are, well, they're busy with Cassie's new artisanal air fern emporium venture anyway." The artisanal air fern emporium, another in a long line of Cassandra's doomed-from-the-start business ideas, following closely on the heels of the gourmet gluten-free gerbil biscuit bakery and the bespoke hand-knitted llama tea cozy collective. Each venture had been launched with tremendous fanfare, usually accompanied by a request for a small, short-term bridging loan from Clara, and by extension, from our joint account, which I primarily funded, and had invariably collapsed within months, leaving behind a trail of disappointed customers, unpaid suppliers, and a Cassandra even more convinced of the world's unfairness to visionary entrepreneurs like herself. My early arrival at the cabin, therefore, and the immediate unwelcome confirmation that Cassandra and Derek were not, in fact, diligently curating air ferns, but were instead deeply ensconced in what appeared to be a high-level strategic summit with my in-laws, was more than just a minor breach of our agreement. It was a glaring red flag, a klaxon sounding in the usually tranquil halls of my risk-assessing mind. Instead of barging in and demanding an explanation, a course of action that would undoubtedly have led to a cacophony of denials, deflections, and Beatrice's inevitable and rehearsed tears, I chose the path of discreet reconnaissance. I circled around to the back of the cabin, to a spot where a dense thicket of rhododendrons offered excellent cover and a surprisingly clear view through the kitchen window and into the main living area. My career had taught me the immense value of observing a system in its natural state before the introduction of an external variable. In this case, my unexpected presence caused its components to alter their behavior. From my vantage point, I watched Cassandra, her hands gesturing with the passionate conviction of a seasoned timeshare salesperson, unfurl the blueprints across the coffee table. Derek, beside her, leaned in, his expression one of almost childlike awe, as if witnessing the unveiling of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Beatrice, perched on the edge of the sofa, was nodding with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her since she'd discovered a 20% off coupon for her favorite brand of sherry. But it was Gregory's reaction that truly riveted me. My father-in-law, a man whose default expression was one of mild, dyspeptic skepticism, particularly where Cassandra's schemes were concerned, was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in concentration, his pipe temporarily forgotten in the ashtray beside him. He asked a question. Cassandra responded animatedly, pointing to a specific section of the blueprints. Gregory then nodded slowly, a look of dawning comprehension, and something else, something that looked alarmingly like agreement, spreading across his features. This was unprecedented. Gregory, actively engaging with, and apparently being persuaded by, one of Cassandra's ventures? The anomaly was so significant, it was like finding a unicorn grazing on Wall Street. After another 10 minutes of intense, hushed discussion, Cassandra rolled up the blueprints with a triumphant flourish. Derek clapped Gregory on the shoulder with a familiarity that made me wince. Beatrice beamed. And then, the most damning transaction of all, Gregory reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew a thick, white envelope, the kind that invariably contains either a wedding invitation or a substantial sum of cash, and handed it to Cassandra. She accepted it with a demure, grateful smile that didn't quite reach her calculating eyes. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a pie-in-the-sky discussion. This involved the transfer of actual, tangible resources. My in-laws, the perennial petitioners for financial aid, were now apparently bankrolling Cassandra. And the source of those funds, a deeply unsettling suspicion began to form in my mind. The cabin. Our cabin. It was our most significant shared asset, aside from our primary residence in the city. Had they somehow convinced themselves they had a claim to its equity? Or worse, were they planning to leverage their temporary custodianship into something far more sinister? Something involving our unwitting participation in Cassandra's latest doomed enterprise? I waited until Cassandra and Derek's ludicrously oversized, leased SUV, another monument to their aspirational, if entirely unfunded, lifestyle, had disappeared down the winding driveway, its tires spitting gravel with an inappropriate urgency. I then gave Gregory and Beatrice another 20 minutes, time for them to congratulate themselves on their newfound entrepreneurial acumen before making my own, deliberately casual, entrance. The element of surprise, I knew, was now my greatest ally. I needed to understand the full scope of their intentions, the precise nature of Cassandra's scheme, before Clara arrived the next day and was inevitably drawn into their web of familial obligation and emotional manipulation. My solitary fishing trip had just been upgraded to a full-blown forensic investigation. The target, Project Pillage the Cabin. The lead suspects, my own, apparently not so retiring, in-laws. The potential collateral damage, my marriage, my finances, and my already severely strained tolerance for familial avarice. The game, as they say in the risk analysis world, was afoot, and the odds, I was beginning to realize, were not in my favor unless I acted swiftly, silently, and with a degree of strategic ruthlessness that would likely surprise them all. They had underestimated me for years, dismissing me as the quiet, accommodating, and vaguely boring spouse of their beloved Clara. They were about to discover that a forensic auditor, when his own assets are threatened, can be a surprisingly formidable adversary. My deliberately casual arrival at the cabin was met with a flurry of poorly feigned surprise and overly effusive welcomes that did little to conceal the underlying tension that now permeated the rustic, pine-scented air. Beatrice, her hand fluttering to her chest in a gesture of theatrical shock, exclaimed, "Arthur, my dear boy, what a delightful surprise. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow with our Clara." Her smile was a little too wide, her eyes a little too bright. Gregory, attempting a bluff, hearty bonhomie that sat on him as comfortably as a porcupine in a hammock, boomed, "Well, well, Arthur, decided to get a head start on the fishing, eh? Can't say I blame you. The base have been practically jumping into the boat this week." A blatant falsehood, I knew, as Gregory hadn't set foot in a boat, or indeed held a fishing rod, in at least a decade, preferring the sedentary comforts of his armchair and his pipe. "Something like that, Gregory," I replied, my tone affable, my gaze sweeping the living room, noting the absence of the blueprints and brochures, but the lingering presence of Cassandra's cloyingly sweet perfume. "Work finished up early, so I thought I'd come up and enjoy a bit of peace and quiet before the full family festivities begin." I paused, letting my eyes meet Beatrice's. "Hope I'm not intruding on your restful retreat." Beatrice tittered, a nervous, bird-like sound. "Intruding? Don't be silly, Arthur. This is your cabin too, of course. Make yourself at home. Can I get you a cup of tea? Or perhaps something stronger? Gregory seems to have located your rather special bottle of scotch." She shot a pointed, if slightly panicked, look at her husband. Gregory, to his credit, had the grace to look momentarily abashed. "Ah, yes, the Abelor," he mumbled, gesturing towards the nearly depleted bottle on the side table. "Remarkable stuff, Arthur. Thought I'd just sample a small dram. For medicinal purposes, you understand. The damp air up here, you know." "Indeed," I said, my voice still mild. "It's excellent for warding off unforeseen chills. So, Cassandra and Derek were just here, I gather? I thought I saw their rather ostentatious vehicle departing as I arrived. Off to conquer the world of artisanal air ferns. Are they?" Beatrice and Gregory exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance, a silent, panic communication that I registered with my internal auditor's precision. "Oh, you know, Cassie," Beatrice trilled a little too brightly. Always full of creative energy. She was just showing us some idea she had for a little lakeside craft collective. Very charming, but rather impractical, I'm afraid. Your father-in-law, with a sound business head, soon pointed out the flaws in her plan. Gregory grunted in what I presumed was meant to be an affirmation of his sagacious business acumen. The narrative was already beginning to fray at the edges. From eco-friendly glamping pods, their earlier, overheard discussion, to a lakeside craft collective in the space of a few hours, Cassandra's entrepreneurial vision was clearly as mutable as her ethics. "A craft collective?" I echoed, feigning polite interest. "That sounds quaint. Did she have any actual products? Or was it more of a conceptual presentation at this stage?" I watched them carefully. Their discomfort was palpable. Beatrice began to fuss with a bowl of slightly wizened apples on the dining table. Gregory suddenly developed an intense interest in the weather patterns visible through the window. "Oh, you know, just some sketches, some ideas," Beatrice said vaguely. "Nothing concrete. She's such a dreamer, our Cassie." "Indeed," I agreed. "And dreamers often require substantial investment to get their dreams off the ground, don't they?" I couldn't help but notice you handed her a rather thick envelope as she was leaving, Gregory. "A contribution to the craft collective's seed fund, perhaps." The directness of my question, though delivered in a conversational tone, clearly startled them. Gregory's head snapped around, his eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and indignation. Beatrice let out a small, involuntary gasp. "Really, Arthur?" Gregory blustered, his face flushing a dull red. "That's a rather personal matter. A small family loan, nothing more. To help Cassandra with some outstanding obligations. Nothing to do with any craft collectives or glamping pods." His denial was clumsy, his attempt to pivot unconvincing. The pieces of their deception were beginning to scatter, revealing the ugly, ill-fitting joins beneath. Outstanding obligations? I pressed gently. I hope it's nothing too serious. Clara would be devastated if Cassandra were in any real trouble. You know how devoted she is to her sister. I let the implication hang in the air. If Cassandra is in trouble, why haven't you told Clara? Why the secrecy? Beatrice rushed to fill the ensuing silence. Oh no, no. Nothing serious at all, Arthur. Just some silly little debts Cassie had accumulated. You know how she is with money. We just wanted to help her out quietly, without worrying Clara. It was a gift, really. Not a loan. And certainly not an investment. A gift. A substantial, 5-figure gift from a retired couple on a supposedly fixed income to their notoriously feckless and financially irresponsible daughter for unspecified, silly little debts. The story was becoming more ludicrous with each iteration. I decided to let them squirm a little longer. I feigned a yawn. Well, all this talk of finances is rather tiring after a long drive. I think I'll just unpack and perhaps try my luck with those base Gregory was mentioning. Unless, of course, I paused, looking directly at them. There's anything else of significance that Cassandra or Derek might have discussed with you? Any other exciting new ventures that might impact, say, the future use or disposition of this rather charming and increasingly valuable lakeside property? The color drained from Gregory's face. Beatrice looked as though she might actually faint. Their eyes, when they met mine, were filled not with the feigned surprise of earlier, but with the stark, unadulterated terror of individuals who realize, with a sickening certainty, that their carefully constructed web of deceit is about to be comprehensively, and perhaps very publicly, unraveled. The audit was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the discrepancies, I noted with a grim internal satisfaction, were multiplying at an exponential rate. The next phase, forensic document examination, was about to commence, and I had a very strong suspicion that Gregory's battered leather briefcase, currently sitting innocently beside his armchair, held the key to unlocking their entire fraudulent enterprise. The charade of polite conversation continued through a tense, largely silent dinner of Beatrice's hastily prepared and consequently rather undercooked chicken. Gregory picked at his food, his usual bombastic pronouncements on the state of the world noticeably absent. Beatrice maintained a stream of nervous, inconsequential chatter about the weather, the local wildlife, and the surprising efficacy of her new brand of antacid, a topic I found particularly ironic given the circumstances. I contributed little, content to observe their discomfort, the subtle, anxious glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. My mind, however, was far from idle. I was replaying the earlier scene, analyzing their reactions, their clumsy attempts at deflection. The blueprints, the glossy brochures, Cassandra's animated presentation, Gregory's uncharacteristic engagement, the thick white envelope. These were not the hallmarks of a discussion about a lakeside craft collective or silly little debts. This was something far more ambitious, far more structured. And the fact that they were so desperate to conceal it from me, and by extension, from Clara, spoke volumes. After dinner, pleading fatigue from my long drive, I excused myself and retired to the small guest bedroom at the back of the cabin, the one Clara and I usually occupied. I waited, listening to the muffled sounds of Gregory and Beatrice tidying the kitchen, their voices low, conspiratorial. It took nearly an hour for the cabin to fall into what I hoped was a deep, guilt-ridden slumber. The rhythmic, if somewhat sonorous, cadence of Gregory's snoring, accompanied by Beatrice's surprisingly robust series of nocturnal sighs and mutters, eventually confirmed it. It was time for Phase 2 of my on-site investigation, a discreet examination of Gregory's briefcase. I moved with the practiced silence of an auditor accustomed to navigating sensitive environments. The floorboards in the old cabin creaked predictably, but I knew their individual personalities, their particular areas of complaint from years of previous visits. Gregory's briefcase was exactly where I had last seen it, beside his armchair in the living room, a worn leather sentinel guarding its secrets. The brass latches clicked open with a soft, almost apologetic sound. Inside, nestled amongst copies of the Financial Times, which Gregory read more for show than for comprehension, I suspected, and a half-completed crossword puzzle, was a slim, professional-looking manila folder. Its label, neatly typed, read, Lakeside Serenity Project, Confidential Investment Proposal. My heart rate quickened. This was it. I carefully withdrew the folder and carried it back to the guest room, my small, powerful maglite, an essential tool for any forensic investigator, literal or metaphorical, casting a focused beam on its contents. The proposal was even more audacious and more amateurish than I could have imagined. Lakeside Serenity Glamping Experience. The cover page proclaimed, featuring a surprisingly slick, if clearly stock photo derived, image of a luxurious tent interior overlooking a pristine, moonlit lake that bore a suspicious resemblance to our own. The proposal, authored by Cassandra Thorne, CEO and visionary, Lakeside Serenity Developments Incorporated, a corporation I was willing to bet a significant sum did not legally exist, outlined a plan to erect 6 exclusive, eco-luxury, geodesic glamping domes on the undeveloped northern portion of our cabin property. Each dome, according to the glossy renderings, would feature a king-sized bed, an in-suite composting toilet, a private yoga deck, and unparalleled panoramic lake views. The projected nightly rates were eye-watering, the occupancy assumptions wildly optimistic, and the financial forecasts a masterpiece of creative accounting that would have made even the most brazen corporate fraudster blush. But the most damning section was titled Phase 1 Funding and Silent Partnership. It detailed an initial investment requirement of £150,000, of which £50,000 was to be provided by G&B Page, Senior Silent Partners, Gregory and Beatrice, clearly. The remaining £100,000 was to be secured via a strategic leveraging of existing property assets, a euphemism I instantly understood for second mortgage on our cabin. And then the kicker, a subclause tucked away in the fine print of the draft silent partnership agreement, a document so riddled with legal errors it was almost comical, stipulated that due to the sensitive nature of the initial land use negotiations and permit applications, the involvement of the co-property owner, Mr. A. Finch, will be deferred until the successful completion of Phase 1, at which point he will be offered a minority stakeholder position, subject to mutually agreeable terms. They weren't just planning to defraud me. They were planning to cut me out almost entirely, reducing me to a minority stakeholder in the commercial exploitation of my own grandfather's legacy, a legacy I had lovingly preserved and shared with Clara. And they were doing it with funds they had systematically and deceitfully extracted from my wife, their own daughter. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it, the cold, calculated betrayal, left me momentarily speechless. I photographed every page of the proposal, every damning clause, every wildly inflated projection. My phone's camera flashed a series of silent, accusatory bursts in the dim light of the guest room. I then found what I was looking for, a partially completed application form for a home equity line of credit from a rather obscure online lender known for its flexible underwriting standards. The property address was clearly ours. The applicants listed were Gregory and Beatrice Page. And on the signature line for the second property owner, my signature line, there was a faint, hesitant pencil tracing of what was clearly an attempt to practice forging my name. They hadn't just considered it. They were actively preparing to commit forgery. The evidence was now complete, irrefutable, and utterly devastating. My surprise fishing trip had yielded a catch that would not just disrupt a family dinner, but potentially land several members of my esteemed in-law family in serious legal jeopardy. I carefully replaced the folder in Gregory's briefcase, ensuring everything was exactly as I'd found it. My mind was already racing ahead, formulating the next steps. Clara was due to arrive in less than 8 hours. She needed to be informed, protected, and Gregory, Beatrice, Cassandra, and Derek needed to be confronted, not with anger, but with the cold, hard, and legally actionable truth of their actions. The serenity of the lake was indeed about to be shattered, but it would be the sound of their ludicrous, fraudulent enterprise imploding under the weight of its own deceit. And I, Arthur Finch, forensic auditor and underestimated son-in-law, would be the one to light the fuse. The first slivers of dawn were painting the sky a pale, watercolor gray as I finished my clandestine review of Gregory's incriminating briefcase. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and frankly, almost comically amateurish in its execution, were the implications not so serious. My in-laws, driven by Cassandra's delusional ambitions and their own latent greed, were on the cusp of committing outright fraud, using our cherished family cabin as the sacrificial lamb for their harebrained glamping pod empire. My immediate priority was Clara. She was due to arrive around noon, blissfully unaware of the nest of vipers she was about to walk into, a nest populated by her own parents and sister. I would not, allow her to be blindsided, to be subjected to their manipulations and lies without being fully armed with the truth. I needed to intercept her, to brief her before she reached the cabin. But how? Calling her now, with Gregory and Beatrice still asleep in the next room, was too risky. They might overhear, and I needed to maintain the element of surprise for the final confrontation. I decided on a different tack. I quickly composed a brief, carefully worded text message to Clara. Morning, love. Surprise. Came up a day early. Thought I'd get some fishing in. Having a bit of car trouble just outside of Oakhaven, the nearest small town to the cabin, about 30 minutes away. Could you possibly meet me at Miller's Diner there when you drive up? Say, around 11:30? Need your moral support, and maybe your AAA card. Love, eh? It was a plausible lie, one that wouldn't arouse her suspicion, but would ensure she stopped in Oakhaven before reaching the cabin. Miller's Diner, a familiar landmark, was the perfect, neutral ground for the difficult conversation that lay ahead. With that crucial message sent, I turned my attention to the next phase of my plan, preparing for the confrontation with Gregory, Beatrice, Cassandra, and Derek. I knew Cassandra and Derek were scheduled to return to the cabin later that morning for what she had grandly termed their final pre-launch stakeholder review, a meeting I now intended to join, uninvited, and armed with considerably more accurate data than they possessed. I retrieved the secure USB drive containing the photographs of the Lakeside Serenity proposal and the forged mortgage application. I also had the damning audio recording of Cassandra's earlier conversation with Gregory, where she'd explicitly mentioned the need to keep me in the dark. My case was ironclad. My solicitor, Arthur Finch, the other Arthur Finch, the one who specialized in untangling precisely these kinds of sordid financial messes, not the disgraced psychiatrist Cassandra had apparently been consulting, was already on standby, briefed on the preliminary findings, and ready to deploy the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike should it become necessary. As the cabin began to stir, Gregory and Beatrice emerging with forced, overly cheerful morning greetings that did little to mask their underlying anxiety, I played the part of the contented early bird, regaling them with entirely fictional and unsuccessful fishing exploits from the pre-dawn hours. Their relief that I seemed to suspect nothing was almost palpable. They exchanged small, conspiratorial glances, convinced their grand scheme was still safely under wraps. At around 10:30 a.m., I made my excuses. Just going to pop into Oakhaven to pick up a few supplies, I announced casually, and maybe grab a proper coffee. This instant stuff Beatrice favors is an acquired taste. Beatrice tittered nervously. Gregory grunted. Neither of them questioned my departure. They were likely relieved to have me out of the cabin, providing them with an opportunity to confer with Cassandra and Derek before their stakeholder review. I drove to Oakhaven, my mind focused, my resolve firm. I arrived at Miller's Diner at 11:15, securing a quiet booth at the back. Clara, true to her punctual nature, walked in at precisely 11:30, her face alight with a smile when she saw me, a smile that faltered slightly as she registered the uncharacteristically grim set of my jaw. Arthur, what's wrong? Is the car okay? You look worried. The car's fine, my love, I said, taking her hands. But we need to talk. About your parents. About Cassandra. And about this cabin. For the next 45 minutes, over lukewarm coffee and a shared plate of largely untouched toast, I laid out everything I had discovered. The blueprints, the glamping pod scheme, the secret meetings, the siphoned loans from our joint account, the attempted fraudulent mortgage, Cassandra's notes about keeping me in the dark. I presented the evidence calmly, factually, much as I would in a professional audit review, though my heart ached as I watched Clara's face cycle through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a profound, shattering wave of betrayal. Tears streamed down her face, silent testament to the depth of the wound inflicted by her own family. She didn't speak for a long time after I finished, simply stared out the diner window at the unremarkable Oakhaven Street scene, her world irrevocably altered. When she finally turned back to me, her eyes, though red-rimmed, held a new, steely resolve that mirrored my own. "What do we do, Arthur?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. "We don't let them get away with this. We don't let them destroy what your grandfather built, what we've built. And we certainly don't let them treat me, or you, like fools to be exploited." "No, my love," I said, squeezing her hands. "We don't. I have a plan. It involves a rather direct confrontation. This afternoon, at the cabin, with all of them present, and with Mr. Arthur Finch on speakerphone, should his particular brand of legal persuasion become necessary." Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, then nodded, a flicker of her mother's fighting spirit igniting in her eyes. "All right, Arthur," she said, her voice stronger now. "Let's go audit my family." We drove back to the cabin in my car, a silent, united front. As we pulled into the driveway, Cassandra's ostentatious SUV was already there, parked with its usual arrogant disregard for spatial economy. The final pre-launch stakeholder review was clearly in full swing. We walked onto the porch, and through the window, we could see them, Gregory, Beatrice, Cassandra, and Derek, huddled around the coffee table, the incriminating blueprints spread out before them, their faces alight with avaricious anticipation. They hadn't heard us arrive. Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and a new, unfamiliar anger. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Ready?" she whispered. I nodded. "Always." And together, we opened the door, stepping into the heart of their conspiracy, ready to present our own, far more comprehensive and infinitely more devastating final report. The serenity of the lake was about to be shattered by the undeniable sound of truth. The moment Clara and I stepped into the living room, the atmosphere, already thick with the cloying scent of Cassandra's ambition and Gregory's pipe tobacco, solidified into a block of stunned, guilty silence. For pairs of eyes swiveled towards us, their expressions a comical medley of shock, horror, and dawning, panicked comprehension. Cassandra was the first to recover, her face flushing a dull, angry red beneath her expensive, artfully applied makeup. "Clara, Arthur, what were you doing here? We weren't expecting you for hours." Her attempt at nonchalance was about as convincing as a $3 bill. Derek, predictably, looked as though he might bolt, his eyes darting towards the nearest exit like a startled rabbit. Gregory half rose from his armchair, a choked, sputtering sound escaping his lips. Beatrice simply stared, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "We decided to arrive a little early, Cassandra," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, though it carried an edge of steel that even Derek, in his Scotch-induced haze, couldn't have missed. "We wouldn't want to miss the final pre-launch stakeholder review for Project Lakeside Serenity, would we, Clara?" Clara, standing beside me, her composure remarkably intact despite the emotional turmoil I knew she must be experiencing, nodded curtly. "No, Arthur, we certainly wouldn't, especially since it seems to involve our cabin, our land, and a rather innovative approach to mortgage financing that apparently doesn't require the consent or even the knowledge of all property owners." Her words, delivered with a cool, precise anger, landed like a series of well-aimed blows. Gregory sank back into his chair, deflated. Beatrice let out a small, whimpering sound. Cassandra, however, rallied, her default setting of aggressive self-justification kicking in. Now, just a minute, she exclaimed, her voice rising. This is a private business meeting. You have no right to barge in here and make accusations. This project is perfectly legitimate. It's going to be hugely successful. We have investors. We have projections. Ah, yes, the projections, I said, allowing a small, humorless smile to touch my lips. The ones that predict a 250% return on investment in 3 years from 6 geodesic glamping domes built on land you don't own, financed by money you don't have, and secured by a fraudulent mortgage you were planning to obtain by forging my signature. Those projections. I held up the secure USB drive, the one containing copies of every damning document from Gregory's briefcase. I must say, Cassandra, your grasp of creative accounting is impressive. Though I fear your understanding of contract law, property rights, and the criminal code regarding forgery and conspiracy to commit fraud is somewhat less developed. The color drained from Cassandra's face. She stared at the USB drive in my hand, as if it were a venomous ASP. How did you? Let's just say, Cassandra, I interrupted, that some of us still believe in the quaint, old-fashioned practice of due diligence. And some of us are rather adept at identifying discrepancies in poorly constructed narratives. Much like your Lakeside Serenity Developments Incorporated, which, according to my preliminary research, doesn't actually appear to exist as a legally registered corporate entity. A rather significant oversight for a CEO and visionary, wouldn't you agree? Derek, who had been inching slowly towards the drinks cabinet, presumably in search of more of my Abelorab to steady his nerves, froze mid-step. A shell company? He stammered, looking at Cassandra with dawning horror. You told me it was all set up. You said the lawyers had handled everything. Oh, shut up, Derek, you imbecile. Cassandra shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely. You were happy enough to believe it when you thought you'd be rich. Clara then spoke, her voice quiet but filled with a profound, sorrowful anger that cut through Cassandra's hysteria like a surgeon's scalpel. Mom? Dad? She said, turning to her parents, who seemed to have shrunk into their respective armchairs. How could you? How could you go along with this? How could you lie to me, take money from me, conspire with Cassie to defraud your own daughter and son-in-law? This cabin, it was Grandpa Finch's legacy to Arthur, a place of peace, of family. And you were willing to turn it into a cheap, tawdry campsite to fund another one of Cassie's ridiculous, greedy schemes. Beatrice burst into noisy, theatrical sobs. We just wanted to help her, Clara. She's had such a hard time. And she promised it would make us all rich. We could have paid you back with interest. We could have bought our own little place by the lake. With money stolen from us? Clara's voice was incredulous. By committing fraud? Is that the example you wanted to set for your grandchildren? Gregory finally found his voice, a hoarse, broken whisper. We made a mistake, Clara. A terrible mistake. We got carried away. Cassandra, she painted such a picture. A picture of what, Father? I interjected, my tone unyielding. A picture of effortless wealth, built on deceit and the exploitation of your own family. A picture that conveniently omitted the part about potential prison sentences for mortgage fraud and conspiracy. I then placed my phone on the coffee table, its screen illuminated. Speaking of pictures, I said, I believe my solicitor, Mr. Arthur Finch, has a few he'd like to share with you. He's on a video call, waiting patiently. He has prepared a rather comprehensive overview of your legal predicament and some suggestions for how you might begin to mitigate the rather severe consequences you are all currently facing. Shall we invite him to join the stakeholder review? The four of them stared at my phone as if it were about to detonate. The name Arthur Finch, a man renowned for his ruthless efficiency in financial litigation, clearly resonated. The final devastating phase of my audit was about to commence. The books of Lakeside Serenity were about to be forcibly and very publicly reconciled. And the bottom line, I knew, would be a reckoning they would not soon forget. The video call with Arthur Finch was a masterpiece of controlled legal demolition. His calm, precise voice filled the cabin's living room, a stark contrast to the ragged breathing and suppressed sobs of my assembled in-laws. He didn't raise his voice, didn't resort to theatrics. He simply methodically laid out the facts, the clear evidence of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, the documented instances of forgery. Even the practice attempts on the application form were damning. Cassandra's unregistered and likely fraudulent corporate entity, the systematic extraction of funds from Clara under false pretenses, and the potential criminal and civil penalties each of them faced. He spoke of prison sentences, of hefty fines, of asset seizure, of irreparable damage to their reputations. He painted a picture not of glamping pod paradise, but of a grim, legalistic hell entirely of their own making. By the time Alastair had finished, Gregory looked like a man who had aged 20 years. Beatrice was beyond tears, simply staring blankly into the middle distance, her face a mask of stunned desolation. Derek, who had somehow managed to acquire and partially consume another large glass of my scotch during Alastair's presentation, was a quivering, incoherent wreck. And Cassandra, for the first time since I had known her, looked truly, comprehensively defeated. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a stark, visceral terror. However, Alastair continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Mr. and Mrs. Finch are reasonable people. They are not, at this juncture, seeking to pursue the full, and rather draconian, extent of the legal remedies available to them. Their primary concern is the immediate cessation of your illicit activities, the full and prompt restitution of all funds improperly obtained from Mrs. Finch, and legally binding assurances that no such attempts to misappropriate their assets or to involve them in any of your creative financial enterprises will ever occur again. He then outlined our terms. A legally binding agreement, to be drafted by him and signed by all four of them within 24 hours, acknowledging their actions, renouncing any and all claims to the cabin or any other assets belonging to Clara or me, and committing to a strict repayment schedule for the funds Clara had advanced with interest. Failure to sign, or any breach of the agreement's terms, would result in Alastair immediately forwarding his entire file to the district attorney's office and the relevant financial fraud units. There was no negotiation. There was no room for maneuver. It was a take-it-or-leave-it offer, a lifeline thrown into the abyss they had dug for themselves. Gregory was the first to crack. "We'll sign," he croaked, his voice hoarse. "Anything. Just make this go away." Beatrice nodded dumbly, tears still streaming down her face. Derek, in a rare moment of lucidity, mumbled his assent. Cassandra remained silent, her eyes fixed on the now-blank screen of my phone where Alastair's implacable face had been. But her silence was the silence of surrender, not defiance. Alastair, with the efficiency of a seasoned general concluding a successful campaign, promised to have the settlement documents couriered to the cabin by a legal assistant within the hour. He then disconnected the call, leaving behind a room thick with the acrid scent of shattered dreams and impending financial ruin. Clara, who had remained a pillar of quiet strength throughout Alastair's presentation, finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She looked at her parents, at her sister, her expression a mixture of profound sadness and a new, hard-won clarity. "I don't think," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I will ever understand how you could do this, how you could betray my trust, our family, so completely. The money is one thing, but the lies, the deceit, that's something else entirely." She stood up. "Arthur and I will be staying in Oakhaven tonight, at the inn. We need some space. We expect you to have read and understood the settlement documents by the time we return tomorrow morning to supervise your departure from our cabin." Her emphasis on "our" was unmistakable. The locks, I made a mental note, would be changed by noon. We walked out of the cabin, out into the clean, fresh air of the lakeside, leaving them to confront the wreckage of their own making. The drive to Oakhaven was largely silent, Clara leaning her head against my shoulder, the tension slowly ebbing out of her. We checked into the small, charming inn, a world away from the toxic atmosphere of the cabin. That evening, over a simple dinner in the inn's quiet dining room, Clara finally spoke at length, pouring out her grief, her anger, her profound sense of disillusionment. I listened, held her hand, offered what comfort I could. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes for a betrayal this deep. Healing would take time, a long time. The next morning, we returned to the cabin. The settlement documents, as promised by Alistair, had arrived and were spread out on the coffee table, each one bearing the shaky, reluctant signatures of Gregory, Beatrice, Cassandra, and Derek. Their bags were packed, piled haphazardly by the front door. The atmosphere was funereal. There were no apologies offered, no further explanations attempted, just a shared, palpable sense of shame and defeat. We watched in silence as they loaded their belongings into Cassandra's SUV, a vehicle that now seemed to mock their deflated aspirations. As they drove away, a cloud of gravel dust their only parting statement, Clara turned to me, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It's over, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yes, my love," I said, putting my arm around her. "It's over." The cabin, our cabin, felt suddenly lighter, cleaner, as if a long festering wound had finally been lanced. The serenity of the lake, so recently threatened by their greed, now seemed to reflect a future of quiet peace, a future reclaimed, a future that was, at last, entirely our own. The surprise fishing trip had indeed been a turning point. It had dragged some very ugly truths out of the murky depths, but in doing so, it had also cleared the waters for a new, more honest, and infinitely more secure beginning. The audit was complete. The books were balanced, and the final, most valuable asset, our peace of mind, had been triumphantly restored. The months following the lakeside serenity debacle were a period of profound adjustment for everyone involved, though the nature of that adjustment varied wildly. For Clara and me, it was a time of quiet healing and a deliberate, focused effort to rebuild the trust that had been so severely damaged, not between us, but in the very concept of family for Clara. We spent more time at the cabin, not as a contested territory, but as our sanctuary, a place where we could reconnect with nature, with each other, and with the simpler, more honest rhythms of life. We changed the locks, installed a new security system, a perhaps overly cautious measure, but one that brought Clara a significant degree of peace of mind, and even with a shared sense of ironic satisfaction, finally got around to planting that perennial garden Clara had always wanted by the lake. It flourished, a vibrant testament to new beginnings. Arthur Finch, true to his word, ensured that the terms of the settlement agreement were rigorously enforced. The funds Gregory and Beatrice had borrowed from Clara under false pretenses were repaid in full, albeit through a series of painful liquidations of their own, surprisingly modest, it turned out, long-term investments. Their fixed income became, for a time, considerably more fixed, and, I suspected, their capacity for future philanthropic investments in Cassandra's ventures permanently curtailed. Cassandra and Derek's marriage, predictably, did not survive the implosion of their glamping pod dreams and the ensuing financial devastation. They separated acrimoniously, each blaming the other for the disaster. Derek, stripped of the reflected glory of Cassandra's aspirational lifestyle, reportedly retreated to the spare bedroom of his long-suffering mother's suburban bungalow, his dreams of effortless wealth replaced by the harsh realities of unemployment and alimony payments he could ill afford. Cassandra, after a period of what Clara's extended family described as dramatic and largely performative despair, eventually landed on her feet, in a manner of speaking. She resurfaced, some months later, as a wellness and mindfulness coach, offering online courses on manifesting abundance and overcoming financial blockages, the irony of which was apparently lost on her, if not on everyone else. Her target audience, I noted with a forensic auditor's grim amusement, seemed to be individuals as desperate and gullible as she herself had once been. Some patterns, it seemed, were deeply ingrained. Our relationship with Clara's parents entered a new, more distant, and far more formal phase. The old, easy familiarity was gone, replaced by a cautious, carefully managed civility. We saw them infrequently, usually at larger family gatherings hosted by other relatives, where our interactions were brief, polite, and largely superficial. Beatrice, when she spoke to Clara, adopted a tone of perpetual, sorrowful martyrdom, subtly implying that she and Gregory were the true victims in all of this, misunderstood and unfairly persecuted. Gregory remained largely silent, his former bluster extinguished, his eyes holding a permanent look of weary resignation. Clara, to her immense credit, navigated these interactions with a grace and firmness that I deeply admired. She was polite, she was respectful, but she was no longer vulnerable to their emotional manipulations, no longer willing to sacrifice her own well-being or ours on the altar of their dysfunction. She had found her strength, her voice, and she used it quietly but effectively to maintain the new, healthier boundaries we had established. One unexpected consequence of the whole affair was a strengthening of my own bond with Clara's older brother, Thomas, a quiet, sensible engineer who had always maintained a discreet distance from Cassandra's dramas and their parents' enabling behavior. He called me a few weeks after the cabin incident, his voice filled with a mixture of apology and a certain grim understanding. "Arthur," he'd said, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what my family put you and Clara through. I always knew Cassie was a handful and that Mom and Dad tended to look the other way. But I never imagined they'd go this far. You did what you had to do, and frankly, it was probably long overdue." His quiet validation meant a great deal, both to me and to Clara. It was a reminder that not all familial bonds are predicated on dysfunction, that true loyalty often manifests as a quiet, unwavering support for what is right, even when it is difficult. As for the cabin itself, it became more precious to us than ever. It was no longer just a piece of property, a legacy from my grandfather. It was a symbol of our resilience, of our ability to withstand betrayal and emerge stronger, our foundations shaken, but ultimately reinforced. We spent many quiet weekends there, fishing, hiking, reading by the fire, the silence broken only by the sounds of nature and our own easy companionship. The ghosts of lakeside serenity had been well and truly exorcised. One cool autumn evening, about a year after the confrontation, Clara and I were sitting on the cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of gold and crimson. A comfortable silence settled between us, the kind that speaks of deep understanding and shared peace. "You know, Arthur," Clara said softly, breaking the quiet, "in a strange way, I'm almost grateful for what happened. Not for the pain, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it brought. It forced me to see my family and myself in a new light. It forced us to clean house, literally and figuratively." I took her hand. "As a forensic auditor, my love," I said, a smile on my voice, "I can attest that sometimes a thorough, uncompromising audit, however initially unwelcome, is the only way to restore integrity to a compromised system." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You're a good man, Arthur Finch," she whispered. "My quiet, methodical, surprisingly ruthless, and entirely wonderful forensic auditor." And in that moment, with the lake reflecting the fiery beauty of the dying day, and the scent of pine, unadulterated by pipe tobacco, filling the air, I knew that we had not just reclaimed our cabin or our finances. We had reclaimed something far more valuable: our peace, our partnership, and our unwavering commitment to a future built on the solid, unshakable bedrock of truth and mutual respect. The books were balanced, the accounts were clear, and the serenity, at last, was entirely and authentically our own.